Welcome everyone to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Derling, and very, very glad to have a returning guest on here. The man that brought you the amazing Van Halen Rising, story of the early career, like pre-debut album career of Van Halen, and also Ted Templeman, platinum producers like in music. Mr. Greg Renoff. Hello, Greg.
Thanks for having me back.
Greg, you're like the, I don't know, people have probably called you like the closest thing to a Van Halen expert because you spent so much time researching the band and, doing these books and just being, a longtime fan. So I thought who better to bring on and talk about what I think is the first new Van Halen release in a long, long time. This little box set here, whatever you want to call it. And this, of course, covers the Sammy Hagar years. It's got the 4 Van Hagar albums, and it's got a disc of studio quote-unquote rarities. And honestly, Greg, a lot of this, there hasn't been anything Van Halen band related to buy. So when this came out, I was kind of excited for a number of reasons because, there's something new to buy by Van Halen. And also, this is an era that I guess I had resigned myself to the fact that we're never going to see proper remasters of this.
Right.
It seemed to be ignored. Like the first 6 albums have been reissued how many times and individually, in a box set format.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for the first time, the Van Halen albums with Sammy Hagar have now been put together in one, I guess, convenient spot. I think the results are mixed. But before we get into that, Greg, I do want to ask you about this because I think that it's important to establish. I'm kind of, let's put it this way. I started really getting into music seriously in 1986.
Mm-hmm.
So why can't this be love? I remember hearing that on the radio, and they came on at the end and said that's the brand new one from Van Halen, and I got to tell you, I was hooked.
Mm-hmm.
And I run into this all the time with people. That's my Van Halen. That's my version of Van Halen. Of course, I went back. Of course, I went back and got the earlier albums. But your research on Van Halen has been very, very expensive. I'm sure it was expensive, but extensive. But
I wish it was cheaper.
Concentrated a lot on the early years,
right?
In your honest opinion, I know this must have been a major for someone that was already into Van Halen. This was a major shakeup, no matter what where you fell as far as liking it or not.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about this time when, number one, when you first found out that Dave was not in Van Halen, they were getting Sammy? Were you aware of who Sammy was? Walk me through that period a little bit.
Yeah, so I was, I guess it would have been between my freshman and my sophomore years in high school. And in terms of the breakup and everything. So yes, I'll start with the Sammy solo stuff. My exposure with Sammy was probably I Can't Drive 55. Or probably I heard heavy metal, like the single heavy metal. I imagine that was played on FM radio in New Jersey quite a bit. That probably would have been the only song. I don't think I'd ever heard a Montrose song on the radio. No, I may have heard it, but I had no real awareness of Montrose or what that was in high school or before. And I was, kind of a casual Sammy fan. I found the video entertaining, and I remember it was played a lot at MTV, and he was kind of memorable because of his jumpsuits, right? That whole thing, the whole video, and the red and the yellow jumpsuits that they put together for the band was actually pretty smart because it was a memorable visual. Who didn't want ripstop nylon to wear the 80s parachute pants or whatever? So, and then for me, my fandom of Van Halen was was basically the 84 tour. I saw them on the 84 tour. I guess they would have broken up by sophomore year, actually, between my sophomore and junior years. But they saw them on the 84 tour in April 84. Enjoyed that whole run. And then I do remember hearing these, or I should say probably more likely reading things in magazines and all these little, they would have these, they weren't gossip columns, but they were sort of news roundups in guitar magazines and circus magazines, whispers, David Lee Roth is not getting along with Van Halen, and I always tell people I never really believed until I saw the Farm Aid clip, and that's when it was sort of like your parents are fighting, and there's somebody in the neighbors are whispering they're going to get a divorce. You don't believe it until Dad actually takes his bag and like walks out of the house, and you're like, oh, it's really happening. And so when Sammy and Eddie were on stage together with Farm Aid, I was like, oh, it's really happening. He's quit or he's gone. For me, that was a singularly devastating event musically. Not personally, but musically an event in my life at that time. I was shocked and everything, and like everybody else in my age group who loved Van Halen, it was kind of I don't, I certainly don't remember anybody in my friend group going good riddance or anything like that. I mean, it was sort of like shocking, and we were all just sort of like, oh, they'll get back together. That was the other thing too. It's sort of like, oh, it'll all work out eventually. This would be like lunch table stuff, and then it was off and running, and then the Dave stuff and the Van Halen stuff. The next album came out, and of course there was the Van Halen, the David Lee Roth solo EP was out already. And of course, that was kind of the launching point for Dave exiting Van Halen. But for me, like that's the thing I always tell people too. It's like as much as I have sort of been, I was a Roth first guy. That's sort of part of the band I flew, the era of the band I fell in love with. But I obviously had a lot more time, as a fan in my formative years, so to speak, as a Sammy Hagar Van Halen fan. I mean, it was just the way it was. And so, I remember one of the things real quick. I remember is that I remember going to see the 5150 tour. I saw it twice in New Jersey. They played at the Meadowlands and at the old Burn and Burn Arena, and the whole like holding up the signs that were anti-Dave. I do remember some of that stuff going on. I was sort of, I sort of felt like that was kind of, I don't know, I wasn't really into that because I wasn't into the whole like let's bash Dave. Yeah, and I think like that. I think that was probably just baked into the cake with those guys. But I remember being kind of like, that's kind of like sucks or whatever. And then I saw Dave, I guess in October of that year. So it would have been like, July or something. And then in October, Dave came through and played. I think he played on his birthday, actually, played in New Jersey. I'm pretty sure I was there. Yeah, I know I was there. I don't remember very much, quite a night, but I was there. So yeah, I mean, so these albums coming back out, I think that's the really thing that's kind of, it's been a long time coming. I have had conversations with people, and people have observed to me that probably since the 80s, in fact, since these came out, unless you were going to buy a Japanese import of these Forever Young remasters, which came out, and I think the early 2000s, I'm not quite sure, but they were in theory remasters. You couldn't buy a new. I mean, you had to buy basically a used or a vintage, whatever was left in stock. Basically, there was no. They were not manufacturing. I don't know when, but at some point they stopped manufacturing 5150 CDs. Right, there was just like no. There was no stock available. It was just all used stuff or whatever. So there was nothing. There was nothing new. So for these to come out, a thing that also I think is kind of interesting is that Van Halen Incorporated is notoriously secretive, and has not been open about sort of the plans. It's sort of, this has been a long time thing. It's nothing new. It's sort of like when something's done, it's done, or we have something to say, we'll say it. But if you read the comment sections on Instagram weeks and really months ago, like Sammy's like, we're putting out the remasters. People are like random people, God bless them, when ask him in the comments, like, what's going on with the Van Hagar releases, and are they coming out? And he'll be like, we're putting all this stuff out, we're going to be all these rare stuff, and there's box. They were talking about box set. So there was sort of I would say a awareness among people who are fans that this was going to happen, but to kind of have them in your hand and everything, it's sort of it's always, you never know with Van Halen, like you just never know, right? So to have it come out, know. Right?
I always, marveled at the fact that for a major band, they've never used social media to their advantage.
Right.
They've always made interesting decisions. And I mean, I think, one of the most interesting, I'll use that word loosely, is when they took Michael out of the photos for the first album, Women Until First. I never understood that. See, that's right up there with, and I understand. I don't understand the whole, the whole holding the signs up. I always thought that you guys don't need to do that, right? And to his credit, Dave wouldn't do that. Right. He'd talk about it a little bit if he was asked, but he wouldn't hold, but yeah, and when A Different Kind of Truth came out, it was like silence, silence, silence. Or to go back a little further, you'd hear the stories and right around the year 2000. Oh, they're back with Dave. They've done 4 new songs.
Right.
Well, where are nothing? So you get it's like Chicken Little. You're like, they're not doing anything.
Right.
Get out of here.
Right.
So yeah, when this finally came out, and really, it's Sammy and Mike that have kept the flame alive for that period, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
I've never seen any. It's strange that you'd have these multi-platinum albums that. Yeah, you're absolutely right about the 5150 CDs. If you know 6 people that owns 5150 on CD, I guarantee they all look the same. That's all the same issue.
Right.
The only
Right. I mean,
difference is,
there's millions of them out there, but you have to go to a used place or something like that.
yeah,
They were not manufacturing these. Again, I don't know when they stopped manufacturing. I shouldn't say that. Maybe that was like just a few years ago, but I imagine it was many years ago that they were like, we're done. We're not making any more of these CDs because there's no real market for them,
it's interesting because I mean, the first 6 would be, I'll say Walmart CDs, right?
Right.
But not after that.
Right.
And yeah, the only variants you would see of those CDs, well, you might find a used one that's a retailer, you might find a used one that's a Columbia House.
Right.
So yeah, to
Right.
have them in a little package is kind of cool. Now, I do have to mention this. I don't think I ever would have noticed this in a million years, but my good friend Matt, who's a designer, the thing that put him off right from the get-go is he said, the logo is crooked. And I said, what? And then I looked at it and I'm like, yeah, the logo's crooked.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll get my tape measure out. Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
get a protractor out. But the thing that I find, again, I love Van Halen. They're one of my favorite bands in any formation. I do have an affinity for the Sammy years. I went back. I loved A Different Kind of Truth. I've got a little bit of time for Van Halen 3. I think that had its moments. I just like the band. But they make interesting decisions. And one of the interesting decisions, I guess if you could call this thing anything, it says on the side 1986 to 1996, and yet we've got 3 songs from 2004. And the rarities, I mean, this is kind of the money, right? For most people like me that have had the CDs, this is supposed to be the drawing card,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
And other than Respect the Wind, because I never bought the Twister soundtrack, I had all of these songs. So I bought the OU 812 CD.
Right.
I bought
Right.
the CD single
Right.
of
Right.
Can't Stop Loving You for Crossing Over. Another thing I find interesting is, however you say it, Baluchitherium, the
Right.
track to the
Right.
instrumental,
Right.
it says it's from the CD Balance. Well, I didn't know it wasn't on the vinyl. I do have the vinyl. It's on the cassette and the CD. So when that came on, I'm like, that's not a rare cut, but I guess
Right.
it is.
Right. Right.
But as you know, and I think most Van Halen fans know, there's more material out there. Like,
Yeah. I mean, look, I think I was chuckling because I had not thought about the subtitle of the 1996. Of course, you're right. And of course, and then it says to 2004 here, but yes, it's sort of a unusual title of the entire collection to have the 1996 and then have tracks in 2004. That said, yeah, I mean, I think here's what I think. I think there was undoubtedly um, an interest in trying to sort of get something out on the market. I say undoubtedly because I think at some point when you have a catalog like this, there's a lot of saying no. I think with this band, there's been a lot of saying no to a lot of things that have been sort of proffered as ideas. I am 100% confident in saying that Rhino, which now kind of controls the sort of, Rhino puts out the product, that Rhino on a regular basis, however regular they can be without being super annoying, it's going, what about this? What about this? What about this? And there's a lot of no's, or there's a lot of no, not yet, or no, maybe we'll do that later. And sort of, I think we know that whatever, as fans, is that whatever differences there of opinion there has been between, let's just say it, between Alex and Sammy, that as soon as this was put out as an idea, I would imagine Sammy was yes, like immediately yes. I mean, I don't think that Sammy's like sitting there worried like, what's my royalty going to be on whatever. Again, did they make 50,000 of these boxes? I don't know. I'm sure they didn't make. we know they didn't make 100,000, right? Whatever, however many they made, however many vinyls they made. I could be, I'm just saying, like, I would imagine it was not a hard negotiation. And then it's just a matter of like, what's the easiest step from point A to point B? And it's just, these were the things that I would imagine were sitting on multi-tracks. These extra tracks were sitting on multi-tracks where they were there mixed. What you and I would want, and I think most Van Halen fans who are impassioned collectors / people who are really into Van Halen we would want Don Landee to go up to 5150 and pull tapes out and go, huh, here's something that Andy Johns worked on with them in 1990, 91. Here's, it's one of those things that isn't finished. It's an instrumental. Let's mix it. Let's mix it and put it out. Or, oh, here's this jam we did during OU812 that was semi-finished, and it's kind of a fun like that. We would want those types of outtakes. Again,
Yeah,
not
absolutely.
Not like empty the vault or going like, oh, this is embarrassing, we shouldn't put this out or whatever. But for something to be in there. Now, again, I don't know I can't say for sure what the decision-making process was about that, but I suspect this was the easiest thing to do, was just go, let's collect all this stuff.
Yeah, it's the stray tracks, right? Yeah.
Pull the mix for this, pull the mix for this, pull the and then take it and be mastered again, and we're done. Rather than sort of having to sort through. And again, that could be, I think we know that could be a matter of just sort of where Alex and whoever else is involved in the decision-making process is emotionally in terms of the stuff. They just may not want to have to like be deeply invested in sort of like that type of, because of their own personal grieving process about losing it. They may not be wanting to get into the whole, they may not be ready to do that. Right. And I can get that. I can understand that. Like that maybe that's difficult emotionally. Like, would Ed want this out? Again, I have no idea. This is purely my speculation. Right. But this was just, to me, this was just the easiest way to get the product. Right, you could re-release the 4 CDs, but then it's like, I can imagine Rhino is saying like, well, we gotta give something, like you gotta give some juice, like you gotta give something. So then it becomes these rarities, and to me, again, I'll give you one last thing because we could belabor this all day. It's like, crossing over. I actually had not been aware that in crossing over, the one channel in crossing over was the original demo that Ed did, I guess, in 1983 with Don. They did then I read about this, and I was actually I just had never known that. I don't know what, again, it came out probably pre-internet time, and I just never read
I didn't know the origins. I only knew, I remember buying, I think, the cassette single of Can't Stop Loving You when it came out. Oh, because Van Halen never did B-sides.
Right.
They're very, very rarely.
And to me, that would have been something, right.
And never at all in the Dave era.
Right.
Like no live tracks, no covers, nothing. So,
to me too, I never knew
tracks to gather together that had appeared somewhere. I guess they probably equalized the volume, and it's kind of neat. I mean, I never bought the Twister soundtrack. I had Humans Being when the best stuff came out in '96, and but one thing that and I understand, like you were saying, it would be emotional to go in and sit and listen. I think a lot of Van Halen fans were all hoping that, much like Prince, we'll see, new Van Halen. Here's 10 songs with Dave. Here's 11 songs with Sammy. Here's, something like that down the road. It could be a long, long time. Maybe they felt, and Al's never on social media, so we never know what Al thinks about anything, right? But you're right. This might have been the easiest thing, and
and that's what I was going to say. I didn't mean to step on you when you were talking, but that's what I was thinking. Like, I can imagine, like, maybe the original quote unquote the Ed demo done in 1983 that became the drum part for Crossing Over. Like, maybe they could have added that in there, mixed that, and put that out there. That's Ed playing drums, bass, and guitar, and maybe keyboards. I'm not quite sure. Maybe that there could have been something. I think there could have been one, like, even if you don't want to do a deep dive, like one or two other things that could have been there, just kind of sweeten the pot. You're not like putting out like, like the jewels of the crown, so to speak, of unreleased stuff, but like a couple of things, like, that maybe, I don't know, like an Ed piano demo or something. Like Ed. I mean, you own a recording studio, you're going to be recorded a lot. You're going to be recorded a lot.
Notorious for recording.
There's going to be There's going to be things like, there could have been like, again, 10 minutes of Ed playing classical piano or something like that. Something to sort of sweeten the pot would have been nice, I have to say. But again, I don't know what the decision making process was beyond.
The fact that it's out at all, I'm always surprised. Sure. I'm always pleasantly surprised when Van Halen does anything, right?
Sure.
And they do a nice job of recreating the sleeves.
Yep.
I would say that. One thing that, as an old school guy, I have a hard time getting used to, Greg. I don't know if it's just me, but this Warner Records, to me, that just does not look right. It should be Warner Brothers. I mean,
I'll tell you a funny story about that is that I sound like I'll be name dropping, but anyone who knows me really knows I'm not much of a name dropper. I'm kind of like a regular guy who just happened to have written a couple books. That Ted Templeman told me that Neil Young called him. I only mentioned this because he's told me there's a couple of times that Neil called him and was like very upset about the new logo. He was actually, again, whenever that happened, like 3-4 years ago, like Ted told me, like, yeah, Neil called me. What about this? You know something about this new label or this new logo? And I said the new Warner. He goes, oh, he hates it. He hates it.
yeah,
So
it's
I
not.
mean, like, so
It's
it's
so
just,
that Warner WB logo is so iconic. I mean,
right,
not just for the records, but if you're like, anybody about grew up on the cartoons, you're just used to seeing it. Warner Records just sounds like it sounds like a newspaper that doesn't normally cover music. Oh, Warner Records
right,
recording art. It's like they don't know what they're talking about. The first
right,
time I saw it, I think, was the reissue of the Fleetwood Mac, the 1980 live album. I'm like,
right,
that's weird. I understand all like we said about, not digging in too deep this time. But one thing that might have been cool to include in this set, and I get the idea when Def Leppard did the last edition of Hysteria that came out, is that they took
right,
the Live in the Round in Your Face and they made a CD out of it. Would have been cool if they'd have taken Live Without a Net and given us just the audio.
right.
That would have been a cool. That would have been a cool thing to put out.
Right. So that was that was Don in the mobile truck at the New Haven Coliseum. Don recorded that on the 20, the multi-track, 24-track, whatever it was, 48-track. They did the whole thing. So I would imagine, yes, those multi-tracks are up at 5150 and could be, yeah, I assume they're up at 5150, that, or maybe they're stored at Warner Brothers or something. But yeah, that would be something else, right? I mean, look, the reality is, again, when you own a recording studio, you record yourself all the time. Yes, I would say like the big ticket things like Live Without a Net or any of the other things. And the other thing I think is interesting too, just as long as we're on this topic, is like, that Sammy and Mike. Well, Sammy's the other half, the VH, the other half,
Yeah,
like
they're
from
called.
Sammy, it's
Yeah,
like quasi official. He's like always like leaking stuff out all the time. Like he's always like some footage from some show I've never seen before up on his, Instagram. And it's always like, that's the vault. There
yeah.
it is. Here it's like, and so again, for me, I don't want like Instagram videos. I would like something a little bit more,
Really good
substantial. Like,
versions. Yeah, like
right. It's something like
he'll
whatever.
put stuff up from the OU812 tour, which there isn't
Right.
a lot. There's
Right.
that
Right.
Japanese gig. That's about all you see from the
Right.
OU812 tour.
Right. So my point is like, even like there's Sammy's telling us like there's lots of stuff on video. There's lots, there is, yes, I think we could talk all day about the stuff that should come out. I'm happy that came out. And again, I really do suspect that this was just, you want to get some product out. Sammy says, yeah, let's do it. It makes sense to put it out. I think it's been generally well received. The sound quality, I would say, is improved. I think, it's hard for me to, I'm not really, there's always a whole thread at Hoffman forums. People who visit the Steve Hoffman forums, it's like 300 page threads on these things. You can read on message boards about guys who really have great systems and can really A/B this stuff. To me, it does sound better.
Well,
they were not.
yeah. 5150 and OU812 are a lot louder.
Yes, and they do sound. I think OU812 particularly, I feel like has more sonic depth to it, and the bass is more. Anyway, there's no bass, whatever people say, but like there does have it has been improved. And again, remastering is going to not fix a mix. And again, that was the other thing too. I think that's been, I think that would be another whole rabbit hole for them to go down to if they ever wanted to remix OU812, remix 5150, or, again, this has been done by a lot of bands. Like Deep Purple did this 20 years ago, probably, where they did like, remixes of stuff off of Machine Head and on one CD and one CD. This is, again, this is 2023. And for us too, as collectors, and, we know that era, the whole box set era is kind of gone. And again, it could be fun to have these up and listen to them. And, but I wish that could have been done, years ago, stuff like that, where, like a, alternate mixes or that type of stuff would have come out. But it could be, it could maybe down the road, I would say, yeah, like here we are, 2023, maybe. But I do really honestly think that there are going to be, more releases coming. I thought, yeah, think that some people might be aware that the MoFi 45 RPM Van Halen debut re-releases or remasters are coming out, which are going to be, I mean, supposedly the kind of the highest quality vinyl you can have in terms of the sound quality. So again, do we need that to go on forever? We have more and more versions of Van Halen's debut. No, but I think the fact that there is some movement on things happening, especially around this sort of like era that had been sort of completely ignored, gives me hope. Again, maybe Live Without, I mean, to me, Live Without a Net, that would be a no brainer. I'll give you my last idea, and I'm sure if Alex was on the Zoom, he would like leave the call or like start would just be unhappy. But like like can you imagine like Alex Van Halen or Alex and Van Halen commentary? Like where you'd be like you'd have a like, oh, this was a fun moment when we did this, or look over here. You see, I dropped my drumstick, and it was actually like we were, I screwed up this stuff. Right. Yeah. To have like again, like to have like that as a like a Alex Van Halen commentary track or something like that. They could do a lot with that. I think that would be very I dare say probably something that Alex would never want to do, but something like that would be a way to sort of juice those types of releases. And,
or even if Sammy, or even if Alex said to Sammy and Mike, you guys go ahead, like I'll listen to it. Okay.
100%. 100%.
And maybe, you know what, maybe you made me think of something else. Maybe one of the reasons that we haven't seen since they put it out on DVD in I think 2004, Live Without a Net, is because there's only one way to rock. I Can't Drive 55.
I never thought about that.
That's
that
part
actually
of it seems to me that's part of the initial, with the brothers, because they did Live Right Here, Right Now. They had what, Eagles Fly, Give to Live, or whatever it was, and they're like, how come, blah 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 blah. Well, he wrote that himself. That's his own. Maybe it's some that, or for that matter, don't they do Rock and Roll by Led Zeppelin? Maybe that's another reason, or they'd have to leave it off. I don't know, but it would. Well, you're right. That would be a great idea to have. It would be a great idea to see Alex, come out into the sunlight again. And
sure, yeah, right. I mean, again, like you could have Sammy and Mike do it or something like that. I mean, there's just there. I guess my point is like we all know there are ways that could make it. Sure, like a Blu-ray call. I don't get Blu-rays anymore, but like a very high def re-release of Live Without a Net would be cool with a remix or a really great stereo mix soundtrack or whatever. That would be fantastic. But again, it just sort of is the same type of things that you're putting out. If you're just going to put out basically like a re-release of Live Without a Net on like when that was on DVD, except the higher quality, it's just sort of like, I don't know. It'd be fine, but it's just sort of a repetition of this, and that's what I'm saying.
That's why I think it would have been perfect to throw in with this. But this is out. I think it's a fun little set. And one more thing, Greg, just to get your 2 cents on it. The 4 Van Halen albums with Sammy. Mm-hmm. How would you rate those? Like, what are if you were going to give them a real quick rating? How did you feel about each of those?
All the first 6 Van Halen records, or the 4 of them?
The starting with 5150.
5150. For me, as a kid, I mean, I would have been like, they're all A's, right? That's what I've been. They're all great. I think, to me, interestingly enough, I think the one that is sort of the one I listen to most frequently is OU812, and that was one where I had just gone to college, and there was a lot of good memories around that record, and that was a very fun time in my life. I really do think, it's funny when Poor and Lawful came out, and I was like, oh, it sounds so good and everything. To me, it's very fatiguing to the ears to listen to it now, and I actually think that some of the songs haven't really aged all that well. I really, that was part of the CD era, I think, of where you had too many tracks on the record, and I'm not sure that the best decisions were made along the way with it. Like, I think there could have been some songs that could have been maybe left off, or a couple. I'm not talking about a lot of them. A couple of them were probably like a little, a little subpar in my estimation now. The one that really actually is always funny because Van Halen love to bag on it. It's very strange. It's like, is Balance. The second side of Balance, especially with, Take Me Back and Feeling and that stuff, it's like incredible. Yeah. But to me, I guess, probably if I was to rank them in terms of my personal favorites, is probably OU812, probably For and Lawful, I guess, because those would have been, one I would have, and then 5150, and then Balance. For me, 5152 just sort of, I don't know, the songs just haven't held up as well in terms of some of the stuff on on balance. I mean, I just have. I know those are sort of like the weird takes that I have on it, but for me, like Summer Nights and stuff like that, I don't know. They just haven't. I mean, yeah, they're great songs. You throw it on them, let's do it, enjoy it. But to me, they aren't as quite as interesting as the stuff on balance. I think the stuff, especially from the little instrumental stuff, the Do in Time, all the little stuff that's on there that are little interlude pieces. It's just a much more interesting listen. Um, but it's one last thing I'll say really quickly is the Inside, this track, the
Yeah,
Inside. So
yeah.
I just did the first part of a two-part interview I did with Don Landee. This one, it came out in Tape Op magazine a few this here a few about a month ago, and the second part will be out in January or so. The second issue will be out with the second half of it. But I talked to Don about Inside, and I said it's a very strange song, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, it was like the worst." He said it took forever to mix, because it was all the voices, they had all the guys talking, and it was very funny to hear him talk about that. At the time, he said it was like, I was like, "Why do we need to put the song on? Why do we need to leave the song on?" And
Yeah.
it just made the record. It's one of those songs too. Again, it's like that like really feels like if there was ever any filler on a Van Halen record, like that
Yeah,
is
it,
filler.
it's it, it's funny
You know,
because you can tell that they mixed it so that you couldn't quite make out everything that's being said. But how
right,
funny would it be to hear the multi-track so you could hear everything that was
right,
said?
right,
Uh,
right, right. It's like stuff like that again, like a period piece or whatever. It's kind of amusing, but there's just
very much.
to me, it's just sort of like it needed, but they got the album out and it was a huge shit. It's like me like crapping on it and it sold like 6 million copies. But
Yeah.
it's just that to me, it's just not as interesting a listen as Balance is. Probably, overall, like the songs obviously are more iconic in the Van Halen history, obviously. I mean, obviously, but like, to me, Balance is a more engrossing, interesting listen to me.
Always will make me wonder what another one would have sounded like. That's the one time I saw them was on the Balance tour, and much like you, 10 years earlier, I was bummed when they said Sammy wasn't in the band. I said, "What do you
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean?" They,
Right.
I had, it was like it seemed like they were on a roll, but.
Right.
So, Greg, I'm going to give you the floor here. What have you got going on? It was really pleased to see you on the Sunset Sound Recorders. I'm a big fan of that YouTube channel.
Mm-hmm.
You did a great job on there. What else
Thanks.
have you got going on right now?
Yeah, I've got a couple things cooking. I mean, the thing I'm looking forward to, as I said, I have the second piece of half of this Don Landee interview is going to come out in Tape Op magazine, and Don has never done an interview like this before. He did the first part, which was covered some Van Halen stuff, but it was mostly about his early career. And I think someone like Don is a classic engineer, which is that he doesn't want the spotlight on him, and just you're there to serve the artist, and you don't want to take credit for things. And so it was just be able to encourage him and just say, look, you had this really interesting career that beyond what people sort of know that you did Doobie Brothers and Van Halen, you did a lot. I mean, one thing I'll tell you, uh, the audience really quickly was shocking to me when I learned. I mean, I don't say shocking, but it was amazing to me is that he mixed Sweet Caroline with Neil Diamond. Before
So
he
he goes
went
back. He goes back a
in
long, long way.
1970, right? So Don was working at a studio in LA called Sun West, and Neil Diamond came into the studio. He used to come in and mix his records there, and Don sat next to Neil Diamond, and they mixed Sweet Caroline. And then I always say to Don, it's like like there's like Panama, Hot for Teacher, and Sweet Caroline are like the three
You'd never
jump or
think
like
that there was a
the
through
stadium
line.
songs, right? And well, the four also like any football game or any like sporting event in America,
Oh
those
yeah,
like four of the most popular songs to be played at any sporting event. I said you're up there. So
there
and
he was.
that was it's an important thing for me personally because I'm really appreciative of what Don and Ted did, and all the guys did who worked on any of those records I love, from Van Halen to Doobie Brothers, all that stuff I love, and just to be able to get his perspective on things, it's been super interesting. So that second half is coming out in January, and so people can look. It's available online, but yeah, Tape Op magazine is obviously a recording industry publication. It's not centered around sort of like quote unquote rock history, but we cover the recording process and the Don's memories of working with artists and what he remembers about these great sessions that Blackwater and all this stuff. I mean, just so many
Yeah,
songs. So it's been cool.
awesome. Greg, thanks for taking the time out and talking a little Van Halen as
Yeah,
usual. And I know people can find you on Instagram.
sure.
And you answer your messages, which is very cool. So yes,
Right.
looking forward to that. That sounds really interesting talking to Don. Thanks for taking the time out,
My
Greg.
pleasure.
And
Anytime.
we hopefully we'll talk to you later and
A-
probably talk some more Van Halen.
Anytime. My pleasure. Talk to you soon,
See you
Tim.
later.
Okay, bye.